some people reached out to me about making a docuseries that turned into Bad Vegan on Netflix. And then that docuseries, I naively thought they're going to be truthful. I shared with them everything. And the docuseries actually ended up being yet another betrayal, in that it was told in a way that you could come away either having sympathy for me, which comes from people who've been through stuff like this and understand how it could happen, or for people who really can't wrap their minds around how this could happen. This monster came in, and the guilt that I feel and the shame that I let him in, I let this man in. And so it does feel like it's my fault that he destroyed everything.
Narcissistic abuse doesn't end when the relationship is over. It continues onward as the story of what happens gets rewritten. A great case in point is Sarma Melngailis, the feature of Netflix's series Bad Vegan. She joins me today to share what's happened to her and how she was made out to look like the culprit in her own story. And you may have noticed that the old cover is back, and I'm so glad that you've been able to find me and that we're on this journey together.
What happened to you?
So I'm very excited to have Sarma join me, and I'd love to have you tell us a little bit about who you are. I know who you are, and when I put together your name in the story, I was really excited to have you reach out to me. But tell for the audience who hasn't made the connection who you are, a little bit about yourself and why we're meeting today and talking.
Well, now I'm most widely known as the subject of the Netflix show Bad Vegan. That's what's made me more widely known. Prior to that, I had a restaurant and a growing brand that started out of New York City. I had a raw vegan restaurant called Pure Food and Wine. It really was, and when I call it spectacular, I'm giving credit to all the people who worked there with me. But it was one of its kind. It was amazing. It was unique. It was growing. I had a beautiful brand. And I, post breakup from a normal, lovely relationship, I was in a vulnerable place, met the wrong guy, and it all got completely obliterated and destroyed. And it also landed me in jail for a while. So, and then on the other side of that, some people reached out to me to make a documentary about what had happened because my story had been covered in the tabloids. My restaurant had been relatively well known, and it became a tabloid story. And the tabloids, of course, were getting all the details wrong, and as very often, and I'd been charged with crime. So, I think what happens often in these cases when people are targeted by a predator like this is that they're smart enough to sort of let you take the fall for the most part. But anyway, the point is, it was a tabloid story. And then from there, some people reached out to me about making a docuseries that turned into Bad Vegan on Netflix. And then that docuseries, I naively thought, a documentary, they're going to be truthful. I shared with them everything and helped them get interviews with all kinds of people, some of which they used, some of which they didn't. And the docuseries actually ended up being yet another betrayal, in that it was told in a way that you could come away either having sympathy for me, which comes from people who've been through stuff like this and understand how it could happen, or for people who really can't wrap their minds around how this could happen, especially to somebody who went to a good school, used to work on Wall Street, ran her own business. How could she be fooled? How could she be conned? And they put in this sort of faulty, manipulated twist ending that would allow people to think that, like, the twist was that I was in on it all along and I really am a criminal and a con artist. So that, just after everything I went through was like another, it was just like getting kicked in the gut really, really hard again. And it's, And then I had already started writing my book. And in fact, I'd probably written most of the rough draft before that show came out, but it took me quite a while to finish it. And so I've recently released a memoir telling my whole story called The Girl with the Duck Tattoo. And it really, it took me a long time to write, or it needed to happen over time, I think, because I think as people who've been through this probably can relate, to this that it really takes a while to digest and understand and come down and thaw and really understand what happened.
Yeah.
And as well as putting together the actual narrative of what happened when I was in a dissociated state half the time and don't remember a lot of it. And I'm going through old digital records and putting it all together, but also taking the reader through as much as I could what was going on in my head, and also sort of reflecting on what was happening and why and how it happened. And I really hope that, it makes people who've been through this feel less alone, less stupid. And then I really also hope that to the extent that younger people read it, they will come away having heard this harrowing story, and, a harrowing story, which I think, I also worked hard to make sure it's entertaining. There's some funny parts that hopefully it's relatable to enough young people that it could be, like a prophylactic. That's not, it's a weird word, but you know what I mean? Like
a preventative,
Maybe some young people in college will read it and go, wow, this is a crazy story. And I could see how this happened to her. And so if they meet somebody who starts to behave in that way, they'll go, that this something is off here, as opposed to stepping right into it the way that I did and the way that so many of us have.
Yeah. What was the first thing that you now, looking back, can see was probably a warning this person was not safe, that they were actually quite predatory?
I mean, where do I even start? There were so many. I mean, part of the issue was that I met him on Twitter, what's now called X. And when you meet somebody in that way, and I've never been on a dating app, I would never do but meeting people in that context where they're 100% in control of the information that they're giving you, whereas if you meet somebody in the workplace or through friends, you see them in their other world, you see how other people interact with them. There's a lot that you can learn about somebody that's genuine in those contexts. But when you meet somebody online, you're relying on simply what they're feeding you. And of course, the fact that he had this very mysterious background was a red flag. And there were so many red flags. And sort of a weird part of my story is that I met him because he and I had had a sort of a, I don't know, we wasn't really dating, but I had been friends with Alec Baldwin. And so when he joined Twitter, he was tweeting back and forth with this guy. And because he followed that guy, and they followed each other, I sort of thought that they knew each other somehow in real life.
Yeah, you assumed positive attributes to him. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that kind of people very often create validation through something like that. And I think, I don't know for sure, but my guess is during the course of my relationship with this man later on, I know for a fact, I'm sure he used the fact that he was in a relationship with me because I had a very public persona as validation that he was legit, because other people would look at him and think, well, she wouldn't have married. I married this guy. The situation was just crazy. But the fact that I married him and, was in this icky relationship with him, other people seeing that would have given him validation so that they might have then, gotten wrapped up in whatever way he was conning them.
Right. Before you met him, did you have sort of a bias about who could have fallen for such a thing? I know so many people say, well, I can see through this. I would never fall for a scam like that, or I can spot a predator. I'm thinking, can you? I struggle to. Did you have that sort of bias as well, thinking that you could avoid such people?
No, I didn't think that. But what's really fascinating in my book, I devote a couple of chapters to a prior relationship where I was involved with your more sort of the more slick version of these types of predators, where, the one around which the Bad Vegan docuseries and my book primarily revolves was a very crazy story, and the guy's kind of bonkers. But prior to that, I was involved with a guy who was sort of like a budding celebrity chef. He wasn't of the level of like the ones who have the big TV shows, but he was very well known in New York and in the restaurant world. And I got into a relationship with him, and he drained me of all the money I'd earned through my Wall Street jobs and then some, and left me in debt. And I was with him for 4 years, and it took me, I went through that process of waking up and realizing that he was, a manipulative, dark person. And one of the things I cut out of my book is this, I ended the chapters with him where I was quoting somebody else. This really happened. This woman who'd known him for a long time. And we're in a bathroom at a food event and washing our hands. And she says, she's asking how I was doing on the other side of that relationship ending. And I said, yeah, I'm doing okay. And she said, well, he's a textbook sociopath. Mm. And it was this moment I went, wait, what? And of course, went home and started doing research and reading books about it. So I had read books about sociopaths, sociopathy, people that lack empathy, that these people are out there. I'd read, a handful of books. And I think what I had was probably that feeling of, well, I've already been struck by lightning. It's not going to happen again. And that what I've learned in the, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people reached out to me after that show and just over time. And I've learned that it's very common that we step into these things more than once. And it's happened to me multiple times. And it's happened to me in other, in a business context. So it's really taken me a while to try to understand. And there's that sort of narrow line of you don't want to victim blame and make it all my fault. But there's also the awareness of what is it about me that has made me a good target. And I always tell other people that I'm talking to who are on the other side of this, that those are the qualities that make us a good target are good. They're good qualities.
Yeah, they are.
Really good qualities. And it's just unfortunate. And it sort of makes sense that the darkest people out there would be drawn to the ones who have these qualities that are exploitable. They come to us because we are these bright, shiny assets.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a certain innocence and or you could call it a bit of a gullibility where we don't, it's like the way that I'm wired, I realize it's just really challenging to wrap my brain around the idea that somebody could be so diabolical. Mm-hmm. Now I feel like it's really sunk in, and now I'm much more wary of it generally. But the idea that somebody could be that diabolical, it's almost like it doesn't, you can't wrap your brain around it. So therefore, that's not the explanation. Therefore, I'll believe his weird stories because that has to be the explanation.
Yeah. There's another theory that's kind of being thrown out there. And I think it's actually a very fascinating one as well. Karen Mitchell, who is, I think she's out of Australia or UK. Anyway, she's on the other side of the world from me. But
I know who she is.
Yeah, she's proposing. She referenced this huge study. I think it was like 33,000. It was a massive amount of survey. It was a self-report survey of men, and roughly 1 in 3, 33% reported that they had used some form of coercive or emotional abuse in a relationship. And 1 out of 10 had admitted that they had been physically violent in a relationship. So her point was, that's a lot of people. You start to think about the number, 1 in 3 men are openly reporting this. That means that the rates are a lot higher than that. But yeah, you're right. There is something about the traits that was found in a Sandra Brown study was agreeableness and conscientiousness. And when you think about that, that's a person you want to hire for a job. It makes them a good team player, makes them trusting. They're very loyal. They work hard. They believe that with hard work, things can happen. And there's somebody that you want on your side. But I do think when I asked Sandra, because she actively worked with the psychopathic groups in prison, she'd say, oh yeah, they say that when somebody like you walks into the room, you just sort of shine. They can see there's something about you that's just different, that they know that you're a good target. But what I also heard is you were in a transition. You already been in a relationship like this, so you're a little maybe discombobulated and, trying to rebuild yourself again. And they're good at spotting that too, people who are in a vulnerable place in their life.
Yeah. I mean, that's a time to be especially wary.
Yeah.
And he didn't get me on the other side of that bad relationship. Once I got out of that relationship with the sort of quasi celebrity chef guy with whom I'd opened the restaurant. And so, I came out of it at least with the restaurant business version of a child. I got to then go on and run that restaurant and build it. And then I grew another brand called One Lucky Duck, and everything was growing. So I felt like, well, at least this is what came from that. And now I'm moving on with my, with my future, and that something good came from that relationship, as dark as it was. But then I was in a relationship with a lovely, amazing human, kind of an old soul. He was much, much younger than me by 13 or 14 years. And we had a drama-free, amazing 4-year relationship that I knew was going to end at some point. And so when it did end, I was just much more heartbroken than I was expecting. And I was also overwhelmed with the business. And, I think I probably was an ideal target because I was in that vulnerable place of being very heartbroken for the first time in my life. And, I think I was just approaching 40 then and was overwhelmed with the business. And, as one of the things that that predators do is keep you overwhelmed. They want you to be overwhelmed and tired and confused. And so to take somebody who's already very busy and overwhelmed and then stir it up even more. I mean, it wasn't hard for him I was a pretty good target. And on top of that, being, I think, not even realizing it at the time, but realizing it much more now, that I definitely am by nature an introvert, and I get overwhelmed generally by being around a lot of people. And I think it makes it that much easier to isolate somebody when they already have a tendency to isolate themselves.
That's an interesting point. And it is something I saw as well. When I take an inventory test, I'm almost 100% introvert. I'm extremely introverted. I know I don't come across ever like everybody assumes that means you're shy or you're socially retreating. No, it's just like working a muscle. You go out and you're outgoing and you're like you're going to the gym. You're working hard when you do that, but you can do that. But yeah, he often stretched me too, kept me tired, on a weird like feeding schedule, weird meal schedule. Kept me stressed, and we were always moving from one drama to the other. And I kept thinking, if we could just like get over top of this next problem, things will quiet down. And it just never happened. It never got quiet. Yeah. It was from chaos to chaos to chaos to problem to problem.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no slowing down because they don't want you to have time to stop and think and process. It's
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I assume because of me being analytical and a psychologist and I'm trying to analyze him, I thought, oh, it's because he's ADHD and he's just bored, which I do think that was a piece of it. They do love novelty, but I also think you're right. There's a strategy to this. That's a great way to control somebody. If you always have them where they barely can recover so that they're so exhausted and stretched that their executive functioning is being pushed to its limits. And the other thing I found was I was extremely confused. I found the whole situation like couldn't tell what was true and not true. It seemed, I always gave him the benefit of the doubt, but I couldn't figure out whether or not this work relationship was going to work or not, whether or not we were okay or not. Did you feel a similar type of confusion, but maybe in a different direction?
Yeah, I was definitely confused all the time. And over time throughout this, I don't even like calling it a relationship. It was I know it's very common now to say that these types of relationships are like being in a cult of one, but mine was like being in a cult of one with all the weird culty aspects of kind of hijacking your spirituality and making you believe weird things. And never, anytime I'd ask him a question or an explanation, I'd get the sort of word salad answer and nothing made sense. And he'd refer to stuff that I'll learn one day, but I'm not there yet. And this is all some sort of a test. And it just constantly keeping me in a completely confused state. And that's certainly one of the
I noticed
tactics.
that because I watched the Netflix series and I did notice that it did feel like he had you. Now, again, I know that it wasn't an honest portrayal, but the parts of it I'm sure were accurate. It was around that confusion. But it struck me as have you heard of the idea that thoughts and feelings are contagious? And that's what struck me as I listened to that part of the story was how contagious it was to you. That in order for you to stay connected in the relationship, you have to agree with their reality or you lose the relationship. And you feel that tension that it's buy in or you're out. And I could tell that it was very persuasive and pulled you in.
Yeah. And what was different in this situation is that it wasn't, I've never been somebody that wanted, I had none then, I still don't, but I had no aspirations of like marrying somebody and being in a relationship. That wasn't my goal. My goal in life revolved entirely around my business. It felt like this is my purpose for being here. I never wanted children, my business, and this brand this is my purpose. This is what I will leave here in the world and why I'm here. And so what he did is that he very craftily, in a way, basically mirrored back to me sort of my hopes and dreams, and then creating this sort of scenario whereby the only way to accomplish my hopes and dreams the way that I wanted to was through him. Mm. So like he was the way through. Yeah. So he really got me attached more in a, sort of guru follower way.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't,
or like enlightenment. You're going to arrive to some place.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, precisely. Like through me, you will arrive and you will be empowered and you can then grow your business however you want and all your debts will be paid and you'll be changing the world and you won't have to, he knew what my past frustrations were, that I'd dealt with some sort of slimy potential investors and men who tried to take control of the business and would have ultimately destroyed it. And so he knew how much that meant to me to be able to move forward and, weaponized all of that. What I wanted was to grow my business with integrity and in a way that would make it last forever. I was not interested in getting a payday and checking out. It was all about the business. And so, of course, they just figure out what are your hopes and dreams, what means the most to you in the world, and where are your vulnerabilities. And, and then that's what they weaponize to get you attached.
Yeah, it makes me sick because what it ultimately does is also it destroys the dream.
Yeah. Obliterate it, not only destroying the dream, but harming all these other people in the process where I'm left feeling responsible, like it's all my fault. All this financial damage and, an entire business of people who not only were they employed there, but they loved it there. That was like their second family, or for some people, their family at that restaurant and that business. And there are people there who, I think one guy in that series, Andrew, he said, if none of this had ever happened, we'd still be working there today. I know that would be true because there were people there who'd been there the whole time or for 10 years. And the fact that this monster came in and the guilt that I feel and the shame that I let him in, I let this man in. And so it does feel like it's my fault that he destroyed everything because I'm the one that allowed it to happen. And that's one of the hardest things to deal with.
Yeah, it is. I had a moment near the end when I finished the first draft of my book, and you're right. Writing these stories are really tough. It took me 3 years, 9 edits, and every time I'd go through, I'd make some massive new conclusion that would be devastating again. And it was a gut-wrenching experience. But near the end, when I was preparing for it to be released, I sat down with my oldest and youngest son, who were adult men. But it financially has impacted them because it's financially impacted me. And I said, you must think that I'm an idiot for what I've done. And I just remember my head collapsed into my lap, sobbing. And my oldest said, no, Mom, he used your best qualities against you. We don't hold you responsible. Yeah. But it's tough because you still sit at that and you think, but there's this whole wreck that happened. And like you, I don't see him as a relationship either. I don't even want to call him my ex. To me, he is nothing. He is a non-thing to me. Yeah. So when you were doing the docuseries, and did you however you want to say that, did you know that it was being twisted? Were you aware of the shifts that were being made? How did all that play out?
Not at all. Not at all. No. And yeah, I mean, the reason why I keep speaking out about it, and I'm very wary of, I mean, as you know, like when you speak out about stuff, very often people will, the trolls will come out and, oh, stop playing the victim. It's like, oh God. But part of why I keep speaking out about it is because it's like it shouldn't happen, and it shouldn't happen to people going forward. And I wrote this whole long thing on my website after Bad Vegan came out, titled, well, I think it was titled Bad Vegan was not a documentary, but the whole point of the art, what I wrote was to explain that there should be a category called docutainment. Like don't say it's going to be a documentary. And, I mean, they moved my words around. They didn't, there's so much stuff they didn't include that had they included would have made a massive difference, and people would never have been able to conclude that maybe I'm a criminal after all. And it was a massive betrayal, especially because, one of the producers who I trusted was somebody I'd known for years. And that's, again, one of those things where I think that in one of your other podcasts, I think you talked about the whole concept of betrayal blindness.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's a thing. Like, you just don't think that somebody that was nice to you in the past, or maybe did a nice thing for you in the past, or you've known for a while, like, you just don't think that somebody is going to betray you and then it happens, and then it happens again, and then it happens again. And anyway, it's, part of the reason why I keep speaking out about it is because I just don't think it should be a thing going forward. Not to mention, it's just, I've had to deal with the consequences of wanting to rebuild, and, people watch that show and they're like, I don't know about her. She seems a little bit off, or, because the show didn't explain how this happened at all. And so I think people, maybe are confused by it, and they think, well, she went to jail, so she must have done something wrong. And that's another thing that people don't understand is, the criminal justice system is not all that. And the number of people who plead guilty to stuff they didn't do, but because pleading guilty is really the only feasible option, or it's just a much better option than the alternative, it's a very, very, very common thing to happen. So, yeah.
In fact, one of the things I have concluded recently, and I don't like this, it makes me sad, and I wonder if you've concluded this as well, Sarma, is that I've realized it's hard to know anybody, really, that I have to allow myself this ramp of trust that builds very slowly over an extremely long period of time, with lots of key moments of pressure, stress, or conflict to help me to understand that I have a sense of this person being trustworthy, that I have had too many people that I thought, because it's almost like I had this doorway, and once you pass the doorway, you're in, and then we can do anything and it will be all great. And I'm like, then I discovered, no, it's not. There's a completely different side of them you had no idea to, that now I'm realizing, no, I've got to really like slow the process down. Not just, I wasn't blindly trusting recently, but I still was giving trust away too fast. And I hear that that's sort of the thing that's happened to you too.
Oh yeah, over and over again. And just like having a default assumption that people are going to act honorably and with good intentions. So yeah, it's happened over repeatedly. And now I'm trying to move forward in a way that I'm not overly guarded, but incredibly cautious. Right. And paying more attention to how things feel. So if, because I think so many people would say this, where they could go back and, even with that producer who, where I experienced that betrayal, I can think back to little things that I observed that made me feel funny and have that feeling of, oh, I would see him kind of be dishonorable with other people, or clearly telling fibs, and telling me stuff he shouldn't have been telling me about other people. And I just like a lot of these little things where you just don't feel good about it.
Right. But you think they'll be different with me. They understand I'm
right.
But they're not different with
just
you.
all the rationalizations. You just think, oh, well, they're just this way because of this and that and blah, 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 blah. And really this person has good intentions. And so I've definitely been guilty of giving people passes over and over again and go, oh, well, he didn't really know that he was doing this. And therefore, like, over and over again, giving people passes, and then, ultimately getting kicked in the face again. So.
Yeah. And I know women in particular have been really trained to not listen to our gut. For me, it's very hard to hear it. I have to, it's like, it's not on mute, but it's on soft. And I have to almost turn it up and say, you don't know this person and something feels off, and maybe you really want this, but doesn't mean it's good for you. It doesn't make it safe.
Yeah. And it can happen very often when somebody, I remember years ago, there was a female who wanted to work at my restaurant so bad and was always like aggressively pitching herself and had a perfectly good resume, but it was like there was just something that felt off.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure that's happened to me in other scenarios where something seems on paper all right, but something just feels off. And,
right.
One of the issues is we don't, if you honor that and don't hire the person, or you don't go on a second date, or I'm not even dating anymore, but if you honor that by not moving forward with that person, rarely do you get the validation that would have turned into a total nightmare. Sometimes you do, but rarely you get that validation. So it's not reinforcing that muscle of, yes, I need to really honor this instinct. So occasionally you'll override it and then you suffer the consequences. But
right. Well, and there's a lot of social pressure to say too that says, well, you're not being very kind to, how do you know? And why do you need to be so negative? That's what also I felt too, is that I've almost noticed that culturally we give predatory people passes, or exploitive people passes, and we're hard on people who are cautious or reluctant. We almost see that as a negative thing, when we avoid risks like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, when you're sort of conditioned to not be confrontational or not want to be perceived as rude, that also just makes it more likely that you sort of go along with something. And in my case, and I describe in my book, after I met him for the first time, I thought, well, that's it. I'm not going to see him again. But I allowed him back in because I never shut that door completely. And I think the fact that he created so much mystery around who he really was probably also a way to get me hooked, because, there's a reason why mystery novels are popular in TV shows, because you want to know what's going to happen. You want an answer. You want an explanation.
Right.
And I kind of kept that door open because I was always curious. Well, who is he really? And you want that, you want that closure of knowing who he is and was he full of shit. And so I never closed the door completely.
Right.
And because of that, he was able to barrel through it, and then, multiple times. And then ultimately everything that happened.
So the you are today, what would you say to yourself looking backwards? Like, what are some of the big takeaways that you've now kind of made maybe for your life? If you were to say, I have a new rule set, this is my guidebook going forward.
You said this yourself, taking things really, really slowly.
Yeah.
And for me, at the moment, I'm, the whole relationship thing for me isn't a factor, because I'm sort of like closed for business. Maybe it's also menopause. I don't know. I have less than zero interest in dudes, a relationship, getting to that whole process, letting somebody in that way. I think I'm also have just been going through, for me, a period of, I think the whole process of healing from these situations requires downtime. And I've been through, people sort of think, oh, I must be recovered and I'm doing great now. No, far from it. But at the same time, I'm going through a period of, I think, releasing a lot of emotions, and maybe from a whole lifetime. But because I spent so much of that time with him, and then even afterwards faced with criminal charges and going to Rikers for 4 months and all of that, there was a lot of dissociation and numbness.
I'll say that sounds very traumatizing. I bet that was just awful.
Yeah, I mean, going through what I went through with him was shitty enough, but then being criminalized and facing jail time and then going back and having to serve 4 months at Rikers and then coming out of that and having having nothing and piles of debt and what I'm going to do. And also coming out into a world that very much doesn't understand what happened at all and is judging me for it. And I'm, awash in shame and guilt for what happened. And then, Netflix docuseries happens and comes out, and then that's not what it was supposed to be. And then there was like a fire hose in my face of, Dr. Phil wants me to come on his show. And I did some podcasts and I'm getting questioned as if I have to explain myself and I'm on the hot seat and blah, all of that. I never really got to slow down and breathe and process. And so, I mean, it's astonishing to me that all of this happened so long ago. I mean, it's almost 10 years since I was arrested. In that moment of being arrested, I wrote in my book, it took arrested to set me free. Because that's what it took to get me away from him. And, and I'm grateful that happened, but it's almost 10 years since that happened. And yeah. I'm now today going through a period of, a lot of emotional release. And the book took me, I mean, I didn't spend 8 years writing the book, but it was 8 years that I was working on it. So there were certainly huge chunks of time, including when I was working on the series that became Bad Vegan, that I wasn't working on it. But it was 8 years of time that I was on and off spending on that book. And so I think that having the book finally come out also has finally allowed me the space to release a lot of the emotions.
What has been the biggest thing that's helped you with the healing process? I can hear a lot that's hindered it or got in the way of it, but what do you found that's helped?
I don't have a therapist. I don't go to therapy. I've had very little outside therapy because basically it's a financial issue for the most part. Therapy is expensive and I'm not in a position to cover that now, but I mean, a lot of alone time really processing it. And I think actually working on the manuscript, as grueling as it was, I'm sure when you're writing your story, it's like you just want to kind of metaphorically throw up, and it feels icky and terrible having to go back there in such detail and put yourself back there. But at the same time, it allowed me to get it out of me. So it's out of me. It's in the book. Talking, like doing podcasts like this is fine. It's lovely. I'm happy to talk about it. And I feel like it's helpful to people, but at least having to retell the story, I feel like I don't ever have to do that again. Like it's in the book. Right. If somebody wants to try to understand what happened, read the book. If you want to ask me questions, fine. But I no longer need to sort of explain myself because I did that through the process of the book. And I think my healing process has just been, I mean, I've listened to so many podcasts of other people's stories, other people's analysis. I've become friendly with people who were in cults and have been through similar things like this and trying to make sense of it and kind of immersing myself in that community and, all the morning journaling and all of that stuff and unplugging from, I used to be kind of a news junkie and a politics junkie, and I followed all of that stuff, and all of those things are distractions. So bit by bit, I no longer have a TV. I hardly watch anything on TV ever at all. Like I don't have a TV. I've just unplugged from all of that stuff and plugged more into myself and, learning meditation, which isn't easy, but it's taken me, now I'm getting better at it and sitting quietly. I love tapping. I don't know if if you're familiar with that. Like they used to call it EFT, like the tapping. That is very helpful, and really purposefully allowing myself the time to get these emotions out. So rather than running out the door, I keep my mornings as much as I can to myself. And I'm lucky. I don't have a roommate. I don't have kids. I don't have a spouse. I don't have a boyfriend. So I have time to myself in the mornings, especially, but I very often feel it like a knot, I feel this funny feeling, and I'll deliberately work on getting it out. And then and then I burst into tears and I cry, and then it feels good. And then so just a lot of very deliberate attention and caring for yourself, and
I love
having
that.
a lot of compassion and forgiveness for yourself, because I think that's what matters. Like, the whole idea of like forgiving these people, these predators, like screw that, whatever. It's like, do you need to forgive a snake that bit you?
Right.
No, but you can just move on from it. And what's more, I think, meaningful is having compassion and forgiving yourself.
That's what I was going to say, too. I found that was probably the most instrumental to me, was recognizing my humanness, allowing myself to be an imperfect person who was vulnerable and made flawed decisions out of a desire to be loved, and to see that with a compassionate eye of understanding that we all want that. That's a normal thing to be looking for.
And I feel like I want to revise what I said, because I don't like that idea of having to forgive myself, because having to forgive, it almost implies you did something wrong.
Right.
It's more like, being your own Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting, where he's like, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. Yeah. Like, that feels really meaningful.
Yeah. So I've moved into more acceptance with myself, and and to have a relationship with myself, to realize that to find the peace, it's always been within me. It's not really outside me. And I think that's a big shift I've made, is from moving from outward to looking inward. And I hear that you've done a similar thing.
Yes, there's sort of a balance of looking for answers, listening to other podcasts and about other people who've been through this, and finding external ways of healing. But there's a balance, and then ultimately you realize it is sitting with yourself and coming back to yourself and spending time with yourself.
Yeah.
And even like Richard Schwartz and IFS, internal family systems, that whole idea of like the various parts of yourselves and addressing those parts of yourself. I mean, I'm doing this completely on my own. I don't have a therapist, but I'm sitting there having, done some research and learned about internal family systems and that whole framework. And you can just do this work with yourself through journaling and sitting in quiet and thinking, and it all of this stuff, it's just over time helps.
It does really help. It really does help. This has been rich. Thank you so much for this discussion and the trust here. I really appreciate this so much. I'd love to jump over to the podcast extra and maybe talk about the few key moments in Bad Vegan that just was wrong. Just outstandingly wrong. But where can people find out more about you, as well as the book, The Girl with the Duck Tattoo?
Well, I'm mostly on Instagram. It's my full name, at Sarma Melngailis. I'm the only one, but I'm easy to find on Instagram. The book, well, there's a website for the book, thegirlwiththeducktattoo.com. And there's links to, people can get a signed copy from me, which is amazing. I love sending those out. Or it's on Amazon, or you can buy it from the printer. It is available from Amazon worldwide. And I love when people reach out to me while they're reading it, or, DM me about something that stood out to them, or even made them laugh or resonated. So I love hearing from people in that way. And I have a website, sarmaraw.com too. And I have a Substack. So I've started writing on a Substack, which is just also Substack and my name.
I appreciate that. Well, you know what? I thought of one more question, if you don't mind. Do you think you'll launch another restaurant at some point? Is that one of your dreams?
As part of what I'm writing about in my Substack, because I moved back to New York to reopen the restaurant in the same location and sort of reclaim everything. And then this is another situation where there was a pretty colossal betrayal, and I've kind of gone through this process again. So that's, I think I referenced a little while ago that the last couple of years have been have been difficult. So all of that is very up in the air, and I don't know what's going to happen, but that is why I moved back here and why I'm sitting in this apartment now, which is right near that location, was because I came back here to rebuild everything, and I'm not really sure what's going to happen at this point.
Well, I'm rooting for you. I'm rooting that the best outcome happens for you. Thank you so much today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode. Are you following me on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube? You can find me at Kerry McAvoy, PhD. Or you can learn more about me and my resources, such as the Toxic Free Relationship Club, at KerryMcAvoyPhD.com. And I'll see you back here next week.